Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and I am doing a very special screencast because I gave you time to work on your projects that are due on Monday. So I thought I would go ahead and talk a little bit about stress and health. I'm going to try to keep this screencast short. This is not going to be one of those things where I do a multi-part thing. I'm going to basically use up the 15 minutes that we have, and whatever I don't finish, we will cover in class, and then we'll start talking about personality on Friday. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that odds are pretty good you're all feeling a little bit right now, and that is the effect of stress, and in particular, what that effect is on your health and your mental well-being. So what is stress? So one of the things that we will often typically tend to find about periods of stress is that we often tend to view stress as something that is either threatening or challenging. So we might say this situation at work is giving me a lot of stress. I'm under a lot of stress at work. This project that we're doing is stressing me out. So just from the way that we talk about stress, it's very easy to see that we view these as threats or challenges, but we also view things like the phrase stressing out. We tend to view that as a response to something that is out in our environment that's putting pressure on us. So how does a psychologist define stress? Stress is a process of registering and responding to either threats or challenges. And these threats and challenges are known as stressors. So stress is when we respond to threats and challenges. The things that cause us stress are known as stressors, and the way that we respond is sometimes referred to as a stress reaction. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, I mentioned in our section on motivation and emotion that the way that you label a particular emotion that you're having affects how you feel it. So the way that you appraise how you're feeling affects how you feel that particular emotion. And the truth of the matter is that the way that we appraise and view our stress matters as well. So one of the things that's actually kind of interesting is that many people report performing well under pressure. Stress can actually give us an opportunity to excel and perform at very, very high levels. And so under certain circumstances, stress can actually have positive effects on us. It can create a greater sense of arousal that helps give us focus. So typically, if we view stress as either something that is short-lived, or we look at it as an opportunity to learn and grow and excel, what we're typically going to find is that stress can have a really positive benefit on our performance. On the other hand, if we tend to find that the things that stress us out are viewed as something that are scary, something we should be afraid of, something that is threatening, that's actually going to hurt our performance. And what we're typically going to find is that we're going to panic, we're going to freeze up, and we're probably not going to perform as well as we normally would. One of the other things that we'll talk about shortly is that stress and the act of responding to stress was never really meant to be a short-term or a long-term situation. Stress and the operation of the sympathetic nervous system, that basic fight or flight response, is meant to be short-lived. It is not meant to be prolonged. And so one of the things that we will find is that over the long term, prolonged stress not only affects our performance in negative ways, but it also hurts our health. So you can kind of see how appraisal can affect how we respond. So let's say that a stressful event is popping up, such as a really tough test. Now, there are two different ways that you could potentially appraise this. You could view it as a threat and go, oh, this is so scary. This is too much for me. I'm not ready for this. I can't handle this. And what we're typically going to find is that you end up doing worse in those situations. If, on the other hand, you apply and view this situation as something that is challenging, an opportunity to learn, show what you know, and grow, we typically tend to find that that stress can provide a greater sense of arousal, of alertness, and it can also help us focus. So, what sort of things in our lives actually create stress? And so, when we look at the things in our lives that create stress, researchers report that the variety of stressful things that we encounter tend to fall into three major categories. The first is what are known as catastrophes. The next is what is known as a life change. The next are known as daily hassles. And so let's kind of talk a little bit about those three different things. So the first is a catastrophe. So one of the things that we will tend to find is that catastrophes are exactly what they sound like. They are major, unpredictable events. So that includes things like a variety of natural disasters and things like that. This is typically going to cause a lot of stress over a long period of time. So I kind of mentioned when we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs that usually in the wake of natural disasters, we're usually trying to focus on getting our needs met. We can't really deal with the emotional fallout until much, much later. And generally, one of the things that we find is that at least for a longer period of time, catastrophes and the way that they happened can create stress. The next thing that we'll talk about that cause stress are things like life changes. And I want to really emphasize that just because something is positive doesn't mean it's not stressful. Things like graduation, which is a very, very happy thing, things like moving in with somebody that you care about or getting married, these are typically viewed by society as positive events, and they certainly can be, but they also require a lot of change. There is a period of adjustment in there. Now, one of the things that we know is that when you look at age in years, we tend to find that young adults in particular tend to report more high stress than older age groups do. And so you might be kind of tempted to wonder why. And the truth of the matter is that for our young adults, they typically are going through major life changes at that point. They're leaving home, they're becoming independent, they're possibly going to college, graduating from college, starting families, starting careers, learning the joy of paying off student loans and things like that. And so those are all major life changes. And in general, most of those are going to tend to happen more in young adulthood. And then finally, we have these daily hassles. So these don't have to be major events to cause stress. So these daily hassles, these little trivial things that we deal with every day, like traffic, long lines, losing items and trying to find out where you put them, things like that, some people can really shake those off. Some of us, myself certainly included, have a tendency to really sweat the small stuff. So these daily hassles, they can include more serious things like issues related to figuring out how you're going to pay all the bills that month, and things like that. It can include a buildup of microaggressions, discrimination, and things like that. And those are certainly serious. And we do know that repeated exposure to these kind of things, especially if shaking those things off is not easy for you, are going to build up more stress in your life. So, stress affects us in a variety of different ways. So, in general, whenever you are dealing with stress, it is going to trigger your sympathetic nervous system. Now, to kind of remind you back in chapter 2, the sympathetic nervous system is part of your peripheral nervous system in a branch called the autonomic nervous system. So a lot of the activities of the sympathetic nervous system are for things like taking care of your organs and your glands. And these are typically not things that are under our conscious control, like things like heart rate, things like blood pressure. And so stress will trigger the operations of the fight or flight response as part of that sympathetic nervous system activation. So our body is getting the energy that we need to either deal with stress by fighting it or by running away from it. And so that will include a variety of different actions. So that will include activation of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which will kick off the operation of the sympathetic nervous system. Typically, the arteries will widen. This is known as vasodilation, to increase blood flow to muscles and glands and things like that. Respiration is going to increase, heart rate is going to increase, blood pressure increases, muscles tense up. The adrenal glands are going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the stomach is going to shut down digestion. And so typically, this will help us deal with stress. But what we know about stress and how the body responds to stress is based off of the work of a researcher named Hans Selye. And he typically looked at how animals responded to various types of stressors. So things like noises, electric shocks, different types of surgeries. And so generally, he found across a wide variety of situations that the body's response to stress was pretty similar. And it could be characterized by 3 different stages. And he termed this the general adaptation syndrome. And so in the first phase, you have what is termed an alarm reaction. So this is when the sympathetic nervous system activates. So you're going to have things like your heart rate increase, your muscles are going to tense, you're going to have increased blood flow to the muscles, and things like that. Phase 2 is what is known as resistance. So whereas the alarm reaction is to mobilize bodily resources and get that energy, resistance is when you're actually in the process of trying to cope with that stressor. So your body is still going to be functioning at a very, very high rate. So you're still having higher temperature, higher blood pressure, more respiration, higher heart rate. Your body is basically mobilized at that point to deal with whatever is stressing you out. And then finally, in phase 3, you have what is known as exhaustion. Now, having your body constantly be mobilized requires a lot of energy. And at some point, your energy is going to run out. And so, what we know is that while the fight or flight response is very good for temporary situations, it really depletes your resources if that stress is prolonged. So what we know is generally your body is going to become exhausted. You're going to be more vulnerable to things like illness, and generally, this is what you're going to see. This even occurs in animals. So your book reports that generally rats that are more prone to being stressed or being fearful tend to die about 15% earlier than rats that are not easily stressed or easily fearful. So there are some different ways that we can respond to stress and cope with that stress. One of the things that we can do is withdraw. We can isolate ourselves from people. And this does help us conserve energy, but it is isolating and it sometimes creates almost a sense of mental paralysis. On the other hand, what we can also do is seek out support from friends and loved ones or provide support to others who need it. And this is sometimes referred to as a tend and befriend response. Generally, what we know is that there are some gender differences here, and I'm being very broad and I apologize. In general, based on socialization, men are more likely to withdraw, women are a lot more likely to engage in that tend and befriend response. And we'll talk about this more on Friday.